In 1967, archaeologists excavating a low ridgetop mound in southern Illinois broke through a layer of compacted soil and found a man. He was lying face down. Beneath him, beneath his entire body, was a platform of more than 20,000 beads made from marine shells. The beads were cream white, the color of old ivory. Each one had been ground and pierced by hand, sourced from the Gulf of Mexico, carried more than 700 miles north to this floodplain. They had been arranged not in a pile, not scattered, but deliberately, precisely, into the shape of a bird. Wings extended, tail fanned, head positioned beneath the man's own head, as if the bird was carrying him forward, as if ascending. The man had been buried on the body of a falcon. Around him in the same mound were 272 other people. Many of them were not buried, they were placed. This is the story of the city that put them there. On the eastern bank of the Mississippi River, in the floodplain east of what is now St. Louis, Missouri, there is a structure that is larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Not by a small margin, its footprint measures approximately 291 meters long and 236 meters wide. The Great Pyramid's sides are approximately 230 meters each. Monk's Mound, as it is now called, after French Trappist monks who farmed its terraces in the early 1800s without understanding what they were farming on, wins the comparison, base for base, by a considerable amount. And it is made entirely of earth. 50 million cubic feet of soil moved in baskets woven from plant fiber, one load at a time, by human hands. It stands 30 meters tall today. When it was active, when a wooden temple stood at its summit, it rose higher still. It was visible for miles across the American bottom. The city that built this mound flourished from approximately 1050 to 1350 AD. At its peak, around 1100 AD, it covered 6 square miles, contained at least 120 earthen mounds, and housed somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people. Conservative estimates put the population at 15,000. Some researchers go higher, as high as 40,000, when the outlying settlements of the surrounding region are included. At the same moment, the year 1100 AD, London had approximately 15,000 people. Cahokia was the largest city in North America, by a margin that would not be closed until Philadelphia grew large enough to challenge it more than 6 centuries later. By 1350 AD, it was gone. Not conquered, not destroyed by an enemy we can name, not buried under a volcano or swallowed by the sea. The people left. Over generations the city emptied. The wooden structures rotted. The great palisade wall fell. The Grand Plaza at the heart of the city returned to grass and weeds and the patient accumulation of windblown soil. When French explorers arrived in the 1680s, they found the mounds. They found the earthworks rising from the floodplain, over 100 of them, green with long grass, shaped in a pattern that clearly was not natural. They named the region after a small, Illiniwek-speaking tribe living nearby, the Cahokia people. The Cahokia people had not built the mounds. They did not know who had. The original builders had no name that anyone remembered. For the next 2 centuries, the mounds would be debated, damaged, built over, and ignored. Treasure hunters dug into them, Farmers ploughed through the smaller ones. A railroad was built through the site in the 19th century. Highway 40 cuts through it today. Of the original 120 earthworks at Cahokia, fewer than 80 remain. In 1982, UNESCO designated Cahokia Mounds a World Heritage Site, one of only 24 in the entire United States, placed in the same category as the Grand Canyon and Independence Hall. The designation came more than 800 years after the city had been abandoned, and more than 300 years after the mounds had been standing empty in a landscape that had entirely forgotten them. The city that appeared overnight. Before 1050 AD, the site was not a city. It was a collection of woodland-era settlements scattered across the American bottom, farmsteads, hamlets, communities of a few dozen to a few hundred people who cultivated maize and gathered wild plants along the floodplain margins. Small post-wall houses clustered in loose arrangements without any particular geometric logic. Cooking fires in the evening, grain stored in pits below the frost line. Children who grew up knowing perhaps 200 or 300 people, knowing a stretch of river, knowing which fields were theirs. A life that had been adequate, that had continued for generations, that had no reason to expect what came next. Archaeologists estimate the total population of the entire American bottom region before 1050 AD at roughly 1,000 to 3,000 people, spread thin, uncoordinated, using the same architectural forms, round-bottomed post-wall construction that had been standard across this region for centuries. And then, within a period archaeologists now call the Loman phase, roughly 1050 to 1100 AD, something happened that has no clear precedent in North American prehistory. The earlier settlements were not gradually transformed, they were demolished. The existing houses were torn down. The old village layouts were erased. A new city grid was imposed on the entire landscape, oriented precisely along a north-south axis, divided into precincts organized around plazas. The Grand Plaza at the city center was artificially leveled. The land beneath it is not naturally flat. It was made flat deliberately through an engineering project that required moving enormous quantities of soil from high points to low points. Monk's Mound began to rise, the Woodhenge circles. The great timber rings to the west began to be erected. The smell of that moment, if you could go back to it, would be fresh-cut green timber and turned earth and smoke. A landscape being undone and remade in the span of a single generation. In the 50 years between 1050 and 1100 AD, the population of the central urban area increased from somewhere between 1,400 and 2,800 people to somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000. That estimate comes from LiDAR-assisted survey of house platform locations across the site, combined with household size modeling from comparable Mississippian contexts. It is not a guess, but it carries uncertainty at its edges. What is not uncertain is the scale of the change. By any archaeological standard, this is an explosion, a sudden, discontinuous surge, unlike anything that had come before in this region. Archaeologist Timothy Poketat, who has spent more of his career studying Cahokia than perhaps any other researcher alive, calls it a Big Bang. He describes the Loman phase as a moment when an entire region's social life, political organization, religious belief, art, and culture were radically transformed, reconstituted on their most basic elements by a highly ambitious group of American Indians and the capital city they were determined to build. There is a candidate worth considering. On the night of July 4th, 1054 AD, a star exploded approximately 6,500 light-years from Earth. The explosion was a supernova, the violent collapse and detonation of a massive star at the end of its life. The remnant of that explosion is now called the Crab Nebula, visible today through even a modest telescope as a faint smear of pink and blue gas in the constellation Taurus. In 1054, there was no nebula. There was a new point of light appearing without warning in a sky people had memorized. So bright it outshone every other object except the moon. It was visible in full daylight. For 23 days it could be seen in the daytime sky alongside the sun. For 653 days, nearly 2 years, it remained visible at night, a guest star that had not been there before and would not stay forever. In the American Southwest, ancestral Pueblo peoples recorded it in rock art. Chinese court astronomers documented it meticulously. What the people of the Mississippi Valley made of it, we have no written record to tell us. The supernova appeared in 1054. The Cahokia Big Bang began at approximately 1050. Within the margin of archaeological dating error, these events overlap. This connection is a minority hypothesis, not a consensus finding. Most archaeologists treat it as speculative, noting that the dating uncertainty spans decades and that correlation is not causation. It is included here as a possibility, not a fact. A new star appearing in the sky, a city appearing on the earth. Whether one caused the other, we cannot say. What no one disputes is that the Cahokia Big Bang was intentional. It was not accidental growth. Someone, a person, a group, a movement, had a plan for what this city was supposed to be, and executed that plan with a speed and decisiveness that left the previous landscape almost entirely erased. The old post-wall houses were replaced everywhere in the central precinct by a new architectural form, wall trench construction, in which entire wall sections were built in continuous trenches rather than individual post holes. Controlled excavation of more than 200 house sites across the Cahokia site reveals this transition happening nearly simultaneously across the precinct, not gradually, street by street, but all at once. Someone had decided what a Cahokian house looked like, and the city complied. The people who came to build this city came from somewhere. Thousands arrived. They left the places they had known and came here to a floodplain that was being demolished and rebuilt in real time, and they found their place in it. They built their wall trench houses. They organized their neighborhoods around community plazas. They watched the mound rising to the north and understood in whatever way the culture communicated understanding that this was the center of something. And then, for the next 2 centuries, they built upward. The mound at the center of the world. Imagine approaching it from the south. You would cross the Grand Plaza first, a flat expanse of carefully engineered ground stretching approximately 500 meters north to south and 300 meters east to west. The land beneath it is not naturally this flat. Low areas were filled with imported soil. High areas were cut down. The entire surface was graded to a precise level and hardened, possibly by controlled burning of the grass, possibly by sustained foot traffic of the thousands who gathered here, creating a firm, pale floor that would have been unlike anything a visitor from the surrounding farmland had ever walked on. Research by University of Illinois archaeologist Timothy Porketat on just 1/4 to 1/3 of the plaza suggests its construction required more than 10,000 person days of labor. That is the estimate for a fraction of the project. And at the northern end of this engineered plain, Monk's Mound rose. If you stood at its base and looked up, it would block the sky. Not partially, at the base's edge, looking north toward the summit, the slope of compacted brown earth would fill your field of vision completely. 4 terraces, stepping inward and upward, the surface would have smelled of the floodplain, rich, dark, slightly mineral, the particular scent of the American bottom's alluvial soil. On its 4th and highest terrace, 30 meters above where you stood, a large wooden temple. Its roof would have been visible from every part of the city. At its peak, in the years around 1100 AD, Cahokia was not a silent place. The sound that traveled furthest from the outer workshop districts was percussion, the patient, repetitive tap of antler tool against marine shell as beadworkers ground and pierced disc after disc, thousands of individual operations for a single string of ornaments. Closer to the palisade wall, the pitch changed to the thin, ringing note of copper being cold hammered against a stone anvil, the metal yielding in small increments with each blow. From the Grand Plaza on a ceremonial morning, when the city's thousands gathered for whatever the solar calendar was marking, the ambient sound of that many people in that much open space would have been unlike anything else north of Mexico. There was no other place on the continent where 10,000 people assembled in one flat expanse and made that particular sound, a city at work, at prayer, at the center of something. The mound contains approximately 50 million cubic feet of compacted soil and clay. Every cubic foot was carried by hand, in woven baskets on human backs, up ramps and pathways cut into the mound's sides, deposited in carefully managed increments that allowed each layer to stabilize before the next was added. Controlled excavations of the mound's upper terraces, conducted in the 1960s through the 1980s, reveal the construction phases as distinct horizontal bands of different soil types, evidence that the mound was built in planned stages, not simply piled up. Construction accumulated over roughly 3 centuries. No single person who helped build Monk's Mound ever saw it finished. Think of what that means to carry your basket to the top of a growing hill for years of your life, knowing the project will outlast you, not building a house for yourself or for your children, but contributing to something that will be finished by people not yet born. The basket carriers of Cahokia were not slaves, as far as the archaeological evidence can tell. There is no evidence of the mass coercion that characterized pyramid building in some other ancient contexts. They were participants in something. We do not know what they believed that something was, but they came every day with their baskets. The alignment of the mound tells us something about what it was meant to be. Survey analysis of the major structures at Cahokia, first undertaken systematically in the 1960s by Warren Whittrey and later refined through GPS-assisted survey, reveals that the mound's long axis runs approximately 5 degrees east of true north, placing it in precise alignment with the solar east, the direction of sunrise at the equinoxes. The Grand Plaza to its south was aligned along this same axis. The Woodhenge circles to the west were aligned along this axis. The burial mound to the south, the one with the man on the falcon, was aligned along this axis. The entire city grid was organized around the movement of the sun. Cahokia was not merely decorated with solar symbolism, it was engineered around it. The sun's path across the sky was the city's organizing principle, its calendar, its cosmology, its claim about what kind of place this was and what it was connected to. For decades after European contact, the mounds were attributed by Euro-American scholars to anyone other than the Native Americans who were actually living in the region, to the Vikings, to a lost tribe of Israel, to a vanished race of superior mound builders who had been destroyed, the argument went, by the very ancestors of the tribes Europeans encountered. This was not a failure of evidence. The evidence was in plain sight. This was the discomfort of a historical moment with a particular answer, the answer being that the indigenous people of North America had built something larger and more sophisticated than anything their European contemporaries were prepared to acknowledge. Warren K. Moorhead, an American archaeologist, conducted the first serious systematic excavations at the site between 1921 and 1927. His findings confirmed what the Earth had always been saying. He worked to secure legal protection for the site. Through his advocacy, the state of Illinois purchased a portion of the land and created a state park to prevent further destruction. Today, you can stand at the summit of Monk's Mound on a clear morning and see the Gateway Arch across the river, a monument to a different kind of ambition, built in the 1960s to stand 192 meters tall. Monk's Mound covers a larger area at its base. It was built without metal tools, without wheeled vehicles, without any written plan to coordinate the effort. It was built by people whose daily act of contribution was small, a basket of earth, and whose collective act across 3 centuries was one of the largest construction projects in the pre-Columbian Americas. The wall that was rebuilt 3 times. Beginning around 1100 AD, at the height of Cahokia's population, the city's ceremonial core was enclosed by a wall. Not a small wall, a palisade 2 miles long, built from 15,000 to 20,000 oak and hickory logs, each approximately 1 foot in diameter and 20 feet tall. Fresh-cut oak smells sharp and tannic, green and slightly bitter. 2 miles of it, set shoulder to shoulder, would have been smelled before it was seen. The logs were sunk into a continuous trench, 4 to 5 feet deep, bound together with horizontal poles woven between them, their exterior surface likely coated with clay to protect against fire. At regular intervals, approximately 27 meters apart, as determined by excavation of the post hole patterns, the wall projected outward into bastions, guard towers built from the same heavy timber, extending beyond the main wall face to allow defenders to observe and attack movement along the palisade without exposing themselves. This was not a fence. This was a fortification. Inside it, a 200-acre precinct, Monk's Mound at its center, smaller mounds arranged around additional plazas, the residences of what appeared to have been the elite, structures larger than the standard Cahokian house, with closer access to the ceremonial core, the Woodhenge circles to the west, and everywhere within this precinct, a quality of space that was unavailable to those living outside the wall. Most Cahokians lived outside it. Outside the palisade, the city extended for miles in every direction. Thatched roof houses arranged around smaller neighborhood plazas, workshops where craftspeople ground shell into beads, hammered copper into ornamental forms, fired ceramics in shapes specific to Cahokia's traditions. These neighborhoods were organized. We can see the regularity in their layout. But they were not the center. A craftsperson working in the outer districts of Cahokia would have spent her days within sight of the mound, but not within the precinct. Her hands would have been coated in the white dust of ground shell. Marine shell, carried from the Gulf of Mexico 600 miles south, has an alkaline mineral smell, faintly oceanic, slightly saline, the scent of something that belongs to an entirely different world. That smell would have been the smell of her work, her hands, the inside of her workshop, the ordinary texture of her days. She would have seen the top of the wooden temple above the palisade wall each time she looked up from the grinding stone. She would have known it was there. She would not, in the ordinary course of her life, have gone inside. What's strange is that the wall was not merely maintained, it was rebuilt 3 times, over approximately 200 years. Each reconstruction required the same enormous investment, 15,000 to 20,000 trees, felled and stripped and transported and set. Detailed analysis of the construction sequences by archaeologist Rachel Campbell, examining the overlapping post-hole patterns in excavated sections of the wall, reveals that each version was systematically improved, the bastions redesigned for greater efficiency, the post spacing refined, the trench configuration adjusted. The third and final wall required 22 to 27% fewer person-hours to construct than the second. A measurable, documented gain in construction efficiency across 2 rebuilding episodes. Someone was learning from experience. Someone was analyzing a project that required years of work and thousands of workers, and identifying where the inefficiencies were and correcting them before the next time. This tells us 2 things. The first, Cahokia's institutional capacity was real. This is not a city that improvised. It is a city that planned, remembered its plans, and refined them over generations. The second, they kept needing the wall. A wall rebuilt 3 times is not just architecture, it is anxiety made of wood. Something made the people inside that precinct feel across 2 centuries that they needed it to be there. Whether the threat was external, neighboring Mississippian groups, populations that had not been incorporated into Cahokia's order, or internal, the pressure of a city whose outer residents were providing labor and surplus but not receiving equal benefit, we cannot say with certainty. There are indications of both. What the wall makes clear is that the Grand Plaza, the Mound, the Woodhenge, the elite residences, these existed behind a barrier. They were not freely available to everyone who lived in Cahokia's shadow. At its maximum extent, Cahokia's urban area covered 6 square miles, including outlying settlements across the American bottom. The population it organized and fed may have reached 40,000 people. No other city in North America would reach this scale until the 18th century. And yet, for all its size, for all the evidence of sustained organizational power, Cahokia left behind no clear political record, no list of rulers, no administrative hierarchy we can trace. We know someone was in charge. The wall was rebuilt 3 times. Someone ordered that. The mound rose for 3 centuries. Someone sustained that commitment. We do not know who they were, or how they held authority, or what happened when one of them died. The wall kept something out, or kept something in. We are not certain which, possibly both. The circle that tracked the sun. 850 meters west of Monk's Mound, archaeologists found holes in the ground. Not random holes, circular arrangements of post holes, each approximately 2 feet wide and 7 feet deep, with a characteristic sloping ramp cut into one side at the angle required to tilt a large post from horizontal to vertical. The posts themselves were long gone. Wood does not survive 1,000 years in the moist alluvial soil of the American bottom. But the compressed earth surrounding each post hole, darker and denser than the surrounding soil, was readable, not just for the location of each post, but for the diameter of what had stood there. 20 feet tall, approximately 1 foot in diameter. Red cedar, the only native evergreen in the region, prized by many Native American traditions for its strength, its resistance to rot, and a fragrance that is clean and resinous and unmistakable. Red cedar smells like preservation, like something that was meant to last. Someone had selected this specific wood for this specific structure and used nothing else. These post holes were first discovered in 1961 by archaeologist Warren Whittree during salvage excavation ahead of a highway construction project. The same construction that would destroy portions of the fifth and final circle before its extent was fully understood. Whittree recognized the circular pattern and its potential solar significance. Subsequent excavation and astronomical calculation confirmed it. There had been 5 successive circles, each one larger than the last, each one with more posts. The sequence ran from approximately 900 to 1100 AD. The circles grew as the city grew. Each generation of Woodhenge rebuilt and expanded in parallel with the rising phases of Monk's Mound to the east. Woodhenge 3, the phase that has been partially reconstructed at the site today, had 48 posts, set at precisely 7 degrees and 30 minutes apart as measured from the center of the circle. The diameter was approximately 410 feet. The posts were 20 feet tall. Standing among them at the right moment, at the hour before sunrise on the morning of the winter solstice, you would have smelled the cedar in the cold air. You would have been able to see through the gaps between the posts the darkened profile of Monk's Mound to the east, and then, as the sky lightened from black to deep blue to the particular cold grey that comes just before winter sunrise, the sun would have appeared to rise directly from the temple on Mound 60, Fox Mound, 14 meters tall, its temple structure raising the silhouette even higher. The light would have come through the specific gap between specific posts that marked this specific morning. This alignment was not accidental. Survey analysis of the post hole positions checked against astronomical calculations for Cahokia's precise latitude and longitude confirms the solar geometry, the summer solstice, the winter solstice, the spring equinox, the autumn equinox, each marked by a different post in the circle, each visible from the same central observation point. For a city without written calendars, without mechanical timekeeping, without any of the administrative tools we use to synchronize collective life across time, the Woodhenge was those things. It told you when to plant, when to harvest. When the ceremonial year reached its turning point, it organized the life of tens of thousands of people around a set of fixed solar moments that never changed. that could be checked every year by anyone standing at the center post. It was a calendar that anyone in the city could read if they were allowed to stand at the center. And here is the detail that stays with researchers who study Woodhenge most closely. The central observation post in Woodhenge 3 is not at the geometric center of the circle. It is offset 5.5 feet east of center. This is not a construction error. Calculation shows it is precisely the offset required to correct for the curvature of the Earth at Cahokia's latitude, to bring the solar alignments into exact precision for a person standing at that specific point on the Earth's surface. Whoever designed this circle understood their position on the planet with enough mathematical precision to compensate for it. No instrument for making this calculation has been found. No written record of the calculation exists. Someone worked it out through observation, through geometry, through accumulated generations of watching the sky from this specific ground, and the answer is still in the Earth, exactly where they put it, 1,000 years later. 3,000 miles away at the same time, the astronomers of medieval Europe were tracking the same sky with tables derived from Greek texts compiled in monasteries, preserved in Latin. At Cahokia, the same sky was being tracked with red cedar posts in a circle on a plain, by people whose names were never written anywhere. The answers were the same. The methods were entirely different. And one of those sets of methods is still legible in the ground, while the monasteries that held the other have mostly turned to rubble. The city at the center of a continent. In the burial mounds of Cahokia, archaeologists have found copper. Not raw copper, worked copper, hammered and shaped into ceremonial forms. Falcon warrior plates, ear spools, axes with heads too thin to be functional. It is a distinctive blue-green, the color of old bronze in a museum case, and it is heavier than it looks. Working copper is not unusual in North American prehistory. The practice of cold hammering native copper dates back more than 7,000 years on the continent. What is unusual is where this copper came from. Lead isotope analysis, measuring the ratio of specific lead isotopes within the copper itself. Ratios that are geologically distinct by region, traces the copper found at Cahokia to the Keweenaw Peninsula of northern Michigan, along the southern shore of Lake Superior, more than 500 miles north of the American bottom. The copper was mined there at outcrops where pure native copper occurs near the surface, transported south along the river systems, the Wisconsin River, the Illinois River, the Mississippi, and worked by Cahokian craftspeople before being placed in the graves of the city's most powerful individuals. From the south came marine shells, the lightning whelk, large, heavy, its spiral a creamy orange-white, and conch shells and the small disc-shaped shells that became the 20,000 beads in the Mound 72 falcon burial. They moved north along the Mississippi River trade network, arriving at Cahokia's workshops as whole shells and leaving as finished objects. 20,000 of them, cream white against the dark burial soil, arranged into the shape of a bird. From the east came mica, thin, transparent sheets that catch light and scatter it in all directions, like holding a piece of frozen sunlight. From the Appalachian Mountains of what is now North Carolina and Georgia, more than 600 miles away. From the west came obsidian, volcanic glass from outcrops in what is now Wyoming and the Yellowstone region, more than 1,000 miles from the floodplain. Obsidian is cold to the touch, black and glassy, its freshly fractured edge so sharp it severs at the cellular level, sharper than a steel surgical scalpel. The obsidian found at Cahokia has been sourced through X-ray fluorescence analysis, which identifies trace element signatures unique to specific volcanic outcrops. It was not used casually. It appeared in elite graves, in ceremonial deposits. And from the Gulf Coast came shark teeth, from species that live only in salt water, carried inland along a chain of exchange from the coast to the river, from the river to the tributary, from the tributary to Cahokia, to be placed in the graves of people who had never seen the ocean, who lived 1,000 miles from the nearest beach, who knew the shark only through its teeth and through whatever stories traveled with them. Cahokia was the most important pre-contact trading hub in North America, a node in a continent-wide exchange system connecting the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast, the Appalachians to the Rockies. The city drew resources from every direction and sent its own forms outward. Its ceramic styles, its shell ornaments, its copper work, its iconography of the falcon warrior, with equal reach. The trade was not purely economic. The goods that moved through Cahokia's network were not commodities, bulk materials exchanged for profit. They were prestige objects. The copper's value was not only its material, but the distance it had traveled, the relationships required to move it, the social debt incurred by its gift. Each object was evidence of a relationship. Copper from Lake Superior meant someone in Lake Superior knew you. Shells from the Gulf meant the river network ran in your direction. Shark teeth from the coast meant the coast had heard of you. When those relationships began to fray, when the political authority of Cahokia's center became less compelling, when what had felt like exchange began to feel like tribute, the goods stopped moving, the network contracted. A city that had defined itself as the center of something larger found itself for the first time merely local. But at the height of its power, in the decades around 1100 AD, to arrive at Cahokia along one of the river trade routes would have been to arrive at the center of a world. Blue-green copper, cream-white shells, cold black glass, light catching mica, the weight of shark teeth from a sea you had never seen, all of it flowing here to this flat plain on the east bank of the Mississippi, where the mound rose 30 meters above the horizon and the cedar posts tracked the solstice sun. The game that moved faster than armies. The object was simple. A disc of polished stone, 2 to 6 inches in diameter, its edges carefully ground smooth, its faces slightly concave. The entire surface worked until it was as smooth as river glass, was rolled across a flat clay surface at high speed. The sound it made was a low, sustained hum as it spun. 2 players ran alongside it, each carrying a wooden spear 8 to 10 feet long. As the disc slowed and began to wobble toward a stop, both players threw their spears to land as close as possible to where the disc would rest. The player whose spear landed closest won. This was chunky, and it spread from Cahokia across the North American continent with a reach that no military campaign in pre-Columbian North America ever approached. Chunky stones have been found at archaeological sites from the Gulf Coast of Florida to the northern plains of the Dakotas, from the Atlantic Piedmont to the Rocky Mountain foothills. Their distribution documented through regional archaeological survey across the eastern half of the continent, traces the map of Cahokia's cultural influence more clearly than almost any other artifact class. Wherever the stones appear in the record, the broader Mississippian cultural complex tends to appear alongside them. The platform mound tradition, the solar cosmology, the birdman iconography, the specific ceramic styles that archaeologists use to identify Mississippian-affiliated communities. The game was not merely sport. Evidence from Cahokia period sites suggests that Chunky functioned diplomatically, that Cahokian envoys carried polished chunky stones when they traveled to neighboring peoples to establish trade relationships or political alliances. The stone was a proposition. Play this with us, and you are connected to what we are building. It was the most portable form of Cahokia's identity, the one thing that could travel faster than copper or shells or iconographic styles. The chunky stones of Cahokia's chiefs were heirlooms, not single-use objects, but lifelong companions, polished and used over decades, accumulating the wear of play and the accumulated status of the lineages that owned them. Some have been found in burials, placed with the dead as objects too important to be left behind. The stone that had been rolled at the Great Plaza, that had been carried to neighboring peoples as a diplomatic offering, that had been handed from a chief to his successor and handled by generations of hands. This object carried a biography that made it valuable beyond its material. When European explorers arrived in the 16th and 17th centuries, long after Cahokia had been abandoned, they found versions of Chunky being played by tribes across the eastern half of the continent. The Choctaw played it, the Cherokee played it, the Lakota played it. Groups who had no knowledge of Cahokia's existence, no memory of the city that had seeded the game across the landscape. Hernando de Soto reported watching chunky games among Mississippian peoples in the 1540s, 600 miles south of Cahokia, 2 centuries after the city was abandoned, and noted the passion with which it was played. He described men gambling everything they owned on the throw of a spear, games lasting for days, the social weight of winning and losing. He did not know where the game came from. The city was forgotten. The game it invented was still being played. Somewhere in the chain of transmission, from Cahokia outward along trade routes and diplomatic exchanges, and the slow movement of people across the continent, the game had survived everything that destroyed the city. It had outrun the flood and the political collapse and the dispersal of the population. 3 centuries after the last person walked away from the American bottom, someone was still rolling a polished stone disc across a flat clay surface in the afternoon light and running alongside it, spear in hand, trying to read where it would stop. The fields that fed a city. The American bottom smells like the river. After the spring flood recedes, and it always recedes, the Mississippi rising and then pulling back, the floodplain smells of wet silt and river grass and something faintly vegetative, like the earth itself exhaling. The soil left behind is dark and fine-grained and extraordinarily fertile. The accumulated gift of a continent's worth of sediment carried south from the Great Plains and deposited here in this wide flat corridor between the river bluffs. The American bottom's bottomland soil is among the deepest and richest agricultural soil in North America. Before Cahokia was built, before anyone thought of building a city here, people were already farming it. They had been for centuries. Cahokia's agricultural system was built on 3 primary crops grown together: maize, beans, and squash. The combination later scholars called the Three Sisters, a polyculture refined over centuries of experimentation. Maize grew tall and provided structure. Beans climbed the cornstalks and fixed nitrogen in the soil. Squash spread along the ground between the rows, shading out competing plants and slowing evaporation from the soil surface. Together, the 3 plants produced more food per acre than any of them could alone, each compensating for what the others depleted. Supplementing the 3 sisters were goosefoot and amaranth, related to modern quinoa, domesticated in the Eastern agricultural complex long before Cahokia, as well as marsh elder and sunflowers and wild plants gathered from the river margins. In the early centuries of the city's occupation, the diet was genuinely varied. Stable carbon isotope analysis of human bone collagen from early period burials, a methodology that reconstructs diet by measuring the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-13 in bone, which reflects the proportion of different plant types consumed over a lifetime, shows a mixed signature: maize, yes, but also beans, wild game, freshwater fish from the Mississippi. As the city grew, the diet narrowed. Bone collagen from burials dating to the population peak, around 1100 to 1200 AD, shows a signature increasingly dominated by maize, not because other foods were unavailable, but because the city had grown beyond what a varied diet could support at scale. Maize was efficient, it could be stored, it could be grown in volume on the deep bottomland soil. It could feed 10,000 people more reliably than a diet that depended on the unpredictable availability of wild game and gathered plants. But maize carries a hidden danger that reveals itself slowly at the population level over generations. Maize contains niacin, vitamin B3, but in a form chemically bonded to fiber that the human digestive system cannot break down without assistance. The solution was already known: nixtamalization, the process of soaking dried maize kernels in an alkaline solution, wood ash, lye, or ground limestone and water that chemically liberates the bound niacin and makes the grain nutritionally complete. Populations from Mesoamerica to the eastern woodlands had practiced this for centuries. Organic residue analysis of ceramic cooking vessels, extracting lipid compounds from the clay matrix that absorbed fats during cooking, shows the chemical signatures of nixtamalization in Cahokia's early phase pottery. The practice was present. The knowledge existed. Someone in every household knew to treat the corn before cooking it. Around 1200 AD, those chemical signatures disappear from the vessel record. The practice stopped. Why? Whether through disruption of the knowledge transmission, through pressure to process corn faster than the method allowed, through changes in the social structures that had maintained the tradition, we cannot say. What we can say is that a city of thousands, already under climatic pressure, increasingly dependent on a single crop, had stopped processing that crop in the way that made it safe. Maize without nixtamalization as the primary caloric source produces pellagra over time. Dermatitis, digestive failure, neurological deterioration, not quickly, slowly, across years and generations, in ways that might have looked like weakness or bad fortune or the displeasure of whatever powers the Woodhenge tracked. Cahokia's farmers had anticipated some risks. Fields were distributed across both the low-lying floodplain and higher upland terraces, a deliberate hedge against a single flood wiping out the entire harvest. Storage pits were dug below the frost line. The system had redundancy built into it. It was not enough redundancy. Sometime around 1200 AD, the sediment cores from Horseshoe Lake placed this event within a margin of 80 years in either direction. The Mississippi River flooded at a magnitude the American bottom had not experienced in 6 centuries. The water rose above the storage pits. The floodplain fields were buried under silt. A farming family on the low ground would have watched the water come up slowly, then faster, over the threshold of their storage pit, through the floor of their house, across the field they had planted that spring. Everything they had put by for winter, gone in the course of days. In the midden, deposits excavated from Cahokia's residential neighborhoods, the household trash that accumulates beside every house where people live for generations. Archaeologists have recovered small ceramic figurines, birds, dogs, bears, each one small enough to fit in a child's palm, too fragile and too impractical for any adult purpose. They show wear in the places small hands hold things. They are not in the burial mounds. They are not in the ceremonial deposits. They are in the household middens, where a child's things go when they break or are outgrown. The city that built the largest earthen structure in North America also had children who wore their toys smooth and eventually lost them in the trash. What those children knew of the city, what the Grand Plaza looked and sounded like from 3 feet off the ground at the edge of a crowd, is not in any record. But the toys are in the ground. And that is where the record begins to go quiet. But here is what no one can fully explain. Mound 72 is a small mound by Cahokia's standards, approximately 2 meters high, 70 meters long, its profile so gradual that from a distance it could be mistaken for a natural swell in the terrain. It is oriented along a southeast to northwest axis. It sits approximately 800 meters south of Monk's Mound. Driving past the site on the highway, you would not notice it. Excavation of Mound 72 began in 1967, directed by archaeologist Melvin Fowler of the University of Illinois. It continued with pauses until 1972. The findings from those 5 years of work have been studied, reanalyzed, and debated ever since. Because what Fowler's team found, layer by layer in the dark soil of that low ridge, sits at the intersection of everything Cahokia was. Its power, its cosmology, its organizational capacity, and the violence that lay at the foundation of all of it. 272 people were buried in Mound 72. They were placed in 25 separate locations within the mound, some individually, some in small groups, some in mass graves. They were placed there over a period of years or decades during the founding period of the city's peak. Radiocarbon dating of the associated materials places the mound's use at approximately 1000 to 1050 AD, the exact moment the Big Bang was underway, the exact moment Cahokia was becoming what it became. At the center of the mound was the man on the falcon. He was in his 40s, older than many people in this period lived to be. Skeletal analysis indicates he was physically robust, well nourished across his lifetime. He lay face down on a carefully constructed platform of more than 20,000 disc-shaped beads made from marine shell, each bead ground and perforated individually, each one cream white against the dark burial soil. The beads had been arranged in the precise outline of a bird, head, neck, wings extended to either side, tail fanning below. The man was laid on this bird with his own head where the bird's head was, his arms where the wings were, his body along the bird's body. He was being carried. He was ascending. This burial is called the beaded burial. The figure it represents, the human falcon composite, the man in the bird, is called the Birdman. He appears on carved sandstone tablets found at Cahokia and at Mississippian sites across the southeastern United States. He appears engraved on shell cups, painted on ceramics, cast in copper repoussé plates found as far south as Georgia and as far north as Wisconsin. He is the most recognizable and most widely distributed figure in Mississippian iconography, associated with the sun, the sky world, the warrior elite, with power that derives not from earthly authority, but from cosmic sanction. He is a symbol of leadership that has been endorsed by the order of the universe itself. Who the man in the beaded burial was, a founding ruler, a sacrificial king, a priest whose death consecrated the city. We cannot say he was buried with extraordinary care. He was placed at the center of a structure that would receive 272 additional dead. Around the beaded burial in the same mound were other interments. Males buried with weapons, projectile points, mica, prestige objects suggesting a warrior identity. Individuals buried without grave goods, placed in positions suggesting they were intended to accompany the central figure, not as mourners, but as attendants. Given. And then in the mass graves, 53 females, ranging in age from 15 to approximately 30 years old. They had been strangled. Their bodies were arranged in 2 distinct layers within the pit, separated by woven matting, stacked in rows with a geometric precision that speaks not of chaos but of preparation. This was not the hasty burial of an epidemic. This was not the aftermath of a raid. This was organized, deliberate, conducted with the same care that Cahokians brought to every other aspect of their ceremonial life. The bodies were oriented, they were separated, they were covered. Before we continue, it is worth pausing here for a moment. The archaeology tells us what happened to these women, the manner of their death, the arrangement of their bodies, the date of the deposit. What it cannot tell us is who they were before that moment. The strontium isotope analysis, measuring the ratio of strontium-86 to strontium-87 in their tooth enamel, a ratio that reflects the specific geochemistry of the water and food consumed during childhood and is unique to geographic regions, tells us that they grew up in the American bottom. They were local. They ate the same food as the rest of the city. They drank the same water. They played chunky, perhaps. They watched the mound rising. They knew the smell of the floodplain in the spring when the river receded and left its dark gift behind. They were, in every material sense, Cahokians, people of the city. What the belief system was that made their deaths necessary, what cosmological logic transformed the killing of young women into a founding act, we cannot access directly. There is no text. The Mississippian belief system was encoded in objects and alignments and acts, not in written explanations. We can observe what was done. We cannot read what it meant to those who did it or to those who witnessed it. What we can observe is this. Mound 72 is aligned along the same solar axis as the Woodhenge circles and Monk's Mound. The southeast to northwest orientation of the burial mound traces the same line that Woodhenge 3 uses to mark the winter solstice sunrise. The sacrifices at Mound 72 were not separate from the cosmology encoded in the city's geometry. They were embedded in it. The dead were placed inside the solar alignment that organized the planting calendar and the ceremonial year and the position of the Great Mound at the city center. The city was founded in a specific alignment. The dead were part of the alignment. 272 people buried during the founding of a city. We have examined one mound. Cahokia has over 100. What the others contain, what the full account of the founding looked like, we do not yet know. And it is possible, given the pace of excavation and the resources available, that we will not know in our lifetimes. This is where the evidence stops explaining itself and becomes simply the fact of what was done. Someone organized this, someone decided what it meant, someone made it happen in the specific geometry of a solar calendar. At the exact moment a great city was being born on the Mississippi floodplain. There are 3 theories for why Cahokia ended. None of them have been confirmed. The first is water, sediment cores taken from Horseshoe Lake, a small oxbow lake adjacent to the Cahokia site, its bed accumulating undisturbed for millennia, were analyzed by geographer Samuel Munoz and published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2015. The cores show a stratum of silt 7.5 inches thick, deposited around 1200 AD, plus or minus 80 years. Silt of that depth, deposited in that time frame, is the signature of a catastrophic flood. A single event depositing enormous amounts of suspended sediment across the floodplain. The same cores, red for pollen content, show that after this layer, evidence of active cultivation nearly disappears. Farming at Cahokia collapsed in the flood's aftermath. The timing coincides with the onset of the Little Ice Age, the centuries of global cooling following the medieval warm period during which Cahokia had flourished. Across the northern hemisphere, monsoon patterns shifted. The American bottom, which had enjoyed unusually stable flood patterns for the 6 centuries of Cahokia's growth, became unpredictable. A city built on agricultural surplus, on the assumption that the harvests would continue, that the river would stay within its familiar channels, found itself confronted with a river that no longer cooperated. The second theory is fracture from within. The palisade was rebuilt 3 times. By 1200 AD, evidence accumulates of internal political instability, changes in burial practices suggesting that the old hierarchies were being contested, shifts in the outer communities suggesting the center's authority was weakening. The evidence of nixtamalization disappears from the cooking vessels. A city of thousands under climatic pressure, politically fracturing, and increasingly dependent on an improperly processed crop. This is not a resilient system. This is a system being pressed from multiple directions simultaneously. Here is what makes Cahokia's end something other than ancient history. Think of the last food disruption you heard about, attributed to weather or a harvest failure in some part of the supply chain you had never thought to consider fragile. Think of the last wall described as a solution to a problem that lived on both sides of it. Think of the last time an extractive arrangement was called an exchange, and the people receiving less than they gave continued to participate because the system had worked before for long enough to feel permanent. Cahokia became dependent on one crop because efficiency felt like security, and for a century it was. It rebuilt a wall 3 times rather than resolve what the wall was meant to contain. It called its trade network mutual when it had become tribute. And when the river sent its signal, the city had no way to reorganize fast enough to respond. None of these patterns died with Cahokia. The third theory is the one that changes the question. The people of Cahokia did not disappear. They dispersed. Over generations they moved into smaller communities along the river systems, onto the plains, into the south. They became other peoples. They took other names. They joined other groups and were joined by others in turn. The Osage Nation, whose traditional territory lies west of the Mississippi in what is now Missouri and Kansas, maintains oral traditions connecting their ancestors to the great mound-building civilization of the eastern floodplain. The Quapaw, the Pawnee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, various tribal traditions and ongoing genetic and isotopic research suggest descent from the people who built these mounds. The descendants of Cahokia are not absent from the landscape. They are present in many places, under many names, having carried what they carried through the centuries of dispersal and arrived, changed, in the present. A 2020 study from the University of California, Berkeley challenged the notion of Cahokia as a lost civilization, a people erased without trace. The study, using fecal biomarkers preserved in Horseshoe Lake sediment to track human population presence, found evidence of continued occupation in the region through the 1500s and beyond. When French missionaries arrived in the 1680s, there were people in the area. There had been people there for the entire interval between Cahokia's peak and European contact. The city did not survive. The people did. The truth is that we do not know which combination of these forces, water, internal fracture, dispersal, explains what happened. We have fragments, the sediment cores, the isotope analyses, the pollen record of the collapsing agriculture, the post holes of the rebuilt palisade, the vanishing nixtamalization signatures in the cooking pots. We have the mounds still standing in the Illinois floodplain, visible from the highway. And we have Mound 72, and the man on his bed of shells, and the 271 others, including the 53 women who grew up in this city, who knew its smells and sounds and rhythms, and who are in the ground at its foundation. What we do not have is a continuous account. No one who lived through Cahokia's rise and fall wrote it down. No tradition preserved the city's name in the form its builders used. No record survived of what the Birdman was called in the language spoken here, or what the people of this city called themselves, or what they believed would come after. 200 million people live within a day's drive of Cahokia Mounds today. Most of them have never heard of it. Monk's Mound is visible from the highway, 30 meters of compacted earth, the largest pre-Columbian structure north of Mexico, right there alongside the interstate, and most people who drive past it mistake it for a natural hill. The UNESCO World Heritage designation sits on a site where the visitor center parking lot is half full on a summer afternoon. A city the size of medieval London, a solar calendar engineered from red cedar posts, offset 5.5 feet from center to correct for the curvature of the Earth, a trade network that carried shark teeth from the Gulf of Mexico and blue-green copper from the Great Lakes, and cold black obsidian from Wyoming to a single point in the middle of a continent. A game that spread to every corner of the eastern half of North America and was still being played 2 centuries after the city that invented it was gone. A mound of 272 dead, a line to the winter solstice sunrise, holding a man laid on a bed of cream-white shells in the shape of a bird. It was all there. For 300 years, it was the center of something organized and intentional and cosmologically elaborate, and, in ways we cannot fully decode, extraordinary. And then the water came, or the walls gave way from within, or the people looked at what they had built, the mound rising over the palisade, the cedar posts in their circles, the basket carriers going up and down through the decades, and decided over the course of generations that they needed to be somewhere else. And the grass grew back over the Grand Plaza, and the red cedar posts rotted in their holes, leaving only the dark impressions in the soil. And the soil moved over the cream-white shells, and the man on the bird, and the rows of women laid carefully in their matting. And the drivers on the highway kept going, past the hill that is not a hill, past the largest earthen structure in the Americas, past the place where someone once decided, in a single human lifetime, at the edge of what might have been a new star rising, to build a city out of nothing on a fertile plain. We do not know what they were thinking when they buried the man on the falcon. We do not know what it meant to them to arrange 20,000 shells into the shape of a bird and lay a man on top of it as if the bird could carry him somewhere. We only know that they did it, and that when they were done, they covered it carefully with earth, and that 1,000 years later, someone with a brush and a trowel found it in the ground, exactly as it had been left.